The State Committee for the State of Emergency was not a spontaneous idea that arose the day before the coup. Everything was prepared in advance, slowly and secretly. Since the beginning of the summer of 1991, there had been a growing sense among the top leadership that the country was falling apart. Gorbachev continued to push through reforms, negotiate with the republics, and weaken central control. This frightened the old party elite. Those who feared the collapse of the USSR the most gathered together: Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, KGB Chairman Vladimir Khrushchev, Vice President Yanev, and several other influential figures. They believed that Gorbachev was no longer in control of the situation. Moreover, in their opinion, he himself was leading the country to disaster. The first concrete plan appeared back in June. At that time, they seriously discussed the option of isolating Gorbachev at his dacha in Foros and taking power into their own hands. But fear, uncertainty, and suspicion prevented them from acting. They did not even trust each other. All negotiations were verbal, without any paperwork, no protocols, no records. People who were accustomed to the iron discipline of the CPSU now acted in complete secrecy, almost like underground activists. Every step was discussed in a small circle. Even the closest aides of the conspirators did not know what was going on until the very last moment. Everything was communicated personally, from person to person. Whispers, hints, meetings in corridors, and closed offices were used. They lived in fear that someone from their own ranks would betray them. There was real paranoia within the system. Nothing was put on paper, no orders, no scenarios, only general phrases. We must save the country. We must not allow it to fall apart. We must act urgently. They hoped that if they quickly removed Gorbachev, the army, the KGB, and television would automatically side with them. But no one thought about what would happen if the people did not support them, or if someone brave enough to go against them appeared. A few days before the coup began, Yazov and Khrushchev discussed the possibility of sending troops into Moscow without Gorbachev's consent, but they feared that the army would refuse to carry out the order. Another fact is that at the key meeting where the fate of the country was decided, no minutes or notes were taken. Everything was decided by word of mouth, as in an underground gang. And so, in an atmosphere of fear, mistrust, and complete secrecy, preparations began for one of the most unsuccessful coups in the history of the USSR. The first day of the coup, 19th August 1991, was supposed to be crucial. According to the GKChP's plan, everything was supposed to go quickly and without resistance. Gorbachev isolated, the army on the streets, television under control, the people in shock, ideal conditions for seizing power. But almost immediately, everything went wrong. It was clear from the morning that the system was not working. Instead of a confident address from the new authorities, the television showed the ballet Swan Lake. The hours passed and people saw silence and music on the screen, as if something was being hidden. Instead of fear, this caused distrust and ridicule. The authorities, who came with tanks and remained silent, looked strange and weak. The information blockade that the conspirators had counted on failed. Radio Echo of Moscow continued to broadcast, and television channel employees passed on information about what was happening to journalists and activists. People began to gather at the White House. They were waiting for explanations and saw that no one could tell them anything clearly. At the same time, it would seem that a huge country should have frozen in fear. But this did not happen. Of the 15 republics of the USSR, only one, Azerbaijan, officially supported the GKChP. The rest either remained silent or condemned it. Even allies within the system itself, such as the heads of the republics, began to keep their distance. No one wanted to be associated with a possible failure. The decree on the state of emergency sounded harsh, But it was not followed by clear action. The tanks stood still but did not fire. Army officers were confused by the orders. In some areas, they were told to act harshly, in others, just to stand by. The people sensed indecision. The members of the GKChP did not even have a single press secretary. At a press conference on the afternoon of 19 August, Vice President Yanayev did not look like a leader, but like a confused man with trembling hands who did not believe what he was saying. One of the key participants, KGB chairman Kryuchkov, began to realize on the night of 18 August that the coup was failing. He called various generals and did not receive clear confirmation of their support. But he could no longer stop the process. He was afraid that the responsibility would then fall on him personally. That's how the first day of the coup ended. Instead of a show of strength, the country saw confusion, uncertainty, and fog. When people in Moscow learned on the morning of the 19th of August that the GKChP had seized power, no one knew what to do. But by the afternoon, a center of resistance had begun to form. It was the White House, the building of the Supreme Soviet of the RSFSR. Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, elected by the people just a couple of months before these events, was there. It was at this moment that Yeltsin did what none of the top leaders dared to do. He openly opposed the coup plotters. Instead of remaining silent or leaving, he went to the White House and began to take action. He organized the defense, summoned the people, and gathered politicians and military personnel who were against the GKChP. One of the most symbolic moments was when Yeltsin climbed onto the armor of a tank and addressed the people. This image was seen around the world. The irony is that this tank had been sent to the White House on the orders of the GKChP. But the tank crews refused to go against the people and stayed nearby, becoming part of the living defense of the White House. Yeltsin signed a decree in which he called the actions of the GKChP a coup d'état. He called for a general strike and civil disobedience. At the same time, he did not hide or speak behind closed doors. He spoke openly, and this had an effect. The support group around him grew by the hour. People brought water and food and built barricades. Deputies, journalists, military personnel, and ordinary Muscovites began to flock to him. In one day, Yeltsin became not just a politician, he became a symbol of resistance. Despite attempts to shut down television and radio, his address was broadcast. His words even reached other countries. People in Europe and the United States saw that Moscow had not only tanks, but also a man who openly challenged the coup plotters. This had a strong impact on the reaction of the international community. Almost all Western leaders began to support Yeltsin, not the GKChP. During those days, Yeltsin hardly slept and did not leave the building, receiving dozens of delegations, discussing every step and managing to conduct live broadcasts. This reinforced his image. He looked like the only person who knew what to do. But even that was not enough to hold on to power. While Yeltsin was speaking from a tank and gathering people at the White House, a completely different story was unfolding in another part of Moscow, one that was hidden from the cameras. A split began within the KGB. Some remained loyal to the GKChP until the end. Others began to have doubts, and some began to act against the coup plotters altogether. In the eyes of most people, the KGB was a force of discipline and fear. But during the August 1991 coup, even this formidable agency began to crack. It would seem that the KGB should have played a key role in supporting the GKChP, but things turned out differently. On the one hand, the formal head of the KGB, Vladimir Kryuchkov, was one of the main conspirators. It was he who coordinated Gorbachev's isolation in Arose. He controlled the special services, wiretapping, surveillance, and the security of top officials. But on the other hand, an internal struggle began within the KGB. Some officers did not want to support the coup. This was especially true of the 9th Directorate, the structure responsible for protecting top leaders. Several people from there began to directly report to Yeltsin information about troop movements, plans to block communications, and even the conspirators' telephone conversations. This allowed Yeltsin's headquarters to act proactively and avoid traps. The atmosphere in the KGB headquarters on Lubyanka was particularly tense. The leaders feared failure and the consequences. There were whispers in the corridors that if the coup failed, everyone would be imprisoned. Some began to destroy documents so as not to leave any traces of their involvement. The panic grew with every passing hour. Some KGB employees deliberately slowed down the execution of orders. They delayed blocking communication channels, did not interfere with the work of radio stations, and did not hinder the movements of the opposition. In other words, they sabotaged orders from above, although they officially remained loyal. During the first day of the coup, informal negotiations began between representatives of the KGB and Yeltsin's entourage. Everything took place in complete secrecy, through intermediaries via personal communication channels without any records. KGB officers, not ordinary ones, but those who had access to classified information, approached people from Yeltsin's team with questions. What will happen if the GKChP fails? Is there a chance to reach an agreement? Yeltsin's answer was simple. Don't interfere, and you'll remain unharmed. Those who support the coup will be held accountable. It was a clear signal, and it worked. Some Lubyanka employees began to leak information. On the 20th of August, Yeltsin was given one of the key pieces of evidence, an audio recording of a conversation between Gorbachev and the coup leaders. In it, Gorbachev can be heard refusing to support the coup and demanding that legitimate authority be restored. This was a blow to the GKChP. The recording was quickly distributed among journalists and politicians, providing additional evidence that Gorbachev was being held by force. This dramatically changed the situation. Even those who had been hesitant began to side with Yeltsin. But there was another side to the agreement. According to some reports, KGB officials stated directly that if Yeltsin promised not to seek revenge after his victory, they would not interfere. In essence, the KGB declared neutrality. They did not arrest anyone from Yeltsin's headquarters, did not interfere in the work of the White House, and did not put pressure on the media. It was an unspoken agreement. Towards the evening of 20 August, Yeltsin personally held a closed meeting with a KGB representative, where he gave a verbal promise not to touch part of the leadership of the agencies if they did not interfere. This step was a turning point. Many in the KGB simply stood aside and waited to see how it would all end. It was this indecision, double-dealing, and fear within the KGB that became one of the main reasons for the failure of the GKChP. Without the confident support of the special services, the coup turned into chaos. But even the army, which was supposed to carry out the main order, suddenly began to retreat. The conspirators were confident that once tanks were brought out onto the streets of Moscow, everything would be under control. The people would be frightened, Yeltsin would flee, and no one would dare to resist. But something happened that no one expected. The army did not take action. The tanks took up positions on the streets and simply stood there. Most of the officers and soldiers were confused. They were not told what was happening. The orders were vague: ensure order, prevent unrest. At the same time, no one directly said that they should shoot or seize buildings. And without clear orders, the army preferred not to get involved in politics. Many commanders refused to carry out the orders of the GKChP on the spot. They understood that if blood was shed, the responsibility would fall on them. Therefore, many stalled for time, waited for clarification, or simply refused to participate. Moreover, there were cases when soldiers defected to the defenders of the White House. People approached the armored vehicles, talked to the military, and brought food. Ordinary conscripts saw that they were not facing enemies, but ordinary citizens. In such a situation, it was impossible to shoot. By the morning of 21st August, some of the armored vehicles, following tacit instructions from their officers, began to withdraw from the center of Moscow, without fighting, without orders from above, simply because everything was clear. The army, which was supposed to ensure the victory of the GKChP, refused to fight, and at that moment it became clear the coup was falling apart. By midday on 21st August, it was clear that the coup had failed. There were no mass arrests in Moscow, no tanks storming the White House, and the people, on the contrary, were taking to the streets more and more actively. Television was already talking not only about the GKChP, but also giving a voice to the defenders of democracy. Western countries spoke out against the coup plotters. All this was happening literally every hour, and everything was collapsing before our eyes. Yeltsin's team took advantage of this. Direct negotiations with the military began, along with open statements and pressure through the media. At that time, the GKChP participants were in the Ministry of Defense building and the House of Soviets. But there was no unity anymore. Everyone was thinking about themselves. Some called home, some discussed escape, and some just kept silent. The mood changed every hour, from aggression to complete confusion. On the morning of 21st August, Marshal Dmitry Yazov, the Minister of Defense who was supposed to command the army, was crying. He realized that the army had not supported them, that even his own people, generals, officers, colleagues, had simply refused to go through with it. He did not shout or give orders. He sat in his chair and said, "Everyone has betrayed us." After that, events unfolded quickly. Khrushchev, the head of the KGB, gave the order to withdraw the troops. The other members of the committee began to disperse. Some went home, others went to the airport, several people tried to fly to Crimea but were detained. The coup failed not because of external pressure, but because it was weak from within. There was no clear plan, no loyal executors, no belief in victory. And on 22nd August, Gorbachev returned from Foros. But the country had already changed. The center of power had shifted. The committee had lost, and Yeltsin had become the de facto leader of the country. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but it was no longer the same USSR. Within 3 days, the people realized that the central government was weak and the Union was falling apart. The GKChP wanted to save the Soviet Union, but in the end it destroyed it completely. Immediately after the events of August, republics began to leave the USSR en masse. In September and October, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan declared independence. The rest followed suit. Everyone wanted to distance themselves from Moscow, from the old regime, from the fear of a return to dictatorship. Gorbachev tried to maintain control, talking about a new form of the Union. But no one listened to him anymore. Real power was in the hands of Yeltsin and the Russian parliament. It was they who passed laws abolishing the validity of Union norms on the territory of the RSFSR. A rapid transfer of everything, the army, the economy, taxes, from the center to the regions began. 4 months after the coup failed, on the 26th of December 1991, the USSR was officially dissolved. Neither wars nor external enemies nor sanctions had achieved this. The country was destroyed in 3 days of uncertainty, fear, and the failure of the coup. And what happened to those who tried to preserve the Union by force? They were not shot or imprisoned for decades. On the contrary, most were given minimal sentences or released on bail. The charges were serious: treason, attempted overthrow of the government, but the punishment was lenient. In essence, they were told, "You lost, just leave." In 1994, the State Duma officially announced an amnesty for all participants in the GKChP. None of them received serious punishment. Some later even returned to work, some in business, some as consultants, and some simply retired. The result of those 3 days was the collapse not only of the coup, but of the entire Soviet system. No one feared the USSR anymore, neither the people nor the republics, nor external forces. Its authority disappeared. The Union did not die in battle, it simply fell apart, and a new era began, with its own heroes, traitors, and new secrets.